Before we begin, take a moment to settle in. The story you're about to hear comes from the deep places of America's national forests, where silence carries weight and not everything lost stays lost. At Podcast Station, we share true inspired accounts from rangers, hikers, and those who've spent long nights in the wilderness, listening to what most people never hear. As you listen, pay attention to how the fear builds and to the choices made when reason starts to fail. When the story ends, we invite you to share your thoughts in the comments, what you believe happened and what you would have done differently. Now, let's begin. I was alone in the ranger station when the transmission came through. The building sunk into the trees like something half buried and forgotten, the rain ticking against the windows with the soft insistence of fingernails. November had stripped the forest down to its bones. The Olympic Peninsula in winter doesn't feel empty. It feels occupied by something that no longer needs you there. I had learned that over 14 years of patrols, searches, and nights spent listening to the woods breathe around me. The radio cracked once, a brief hiss of static that made my shoulders tighten, then a voice cut through. Steady, professional, strained in a way that told me the speaker was trying very hard not to sound afraid. Channel 9. This is Unit Echo 7. Do you copy? My hand stopped halfway to the mug of coffee I'd reheated too many times to count. Channel 9 was not an active frequency. It hadn't been for years. We kept it logged for archival reasons only, a ghost channel associated with an incident no one liked to discuss out loud. I answered anyway, because that is what rangers do. We respond. We listen. We act before we allow ourselves the luxury of disbelief. This is Olympic Dispatch, I said, keeping my voice neutral. Echo 7, identify your location. There was a pause, just long enough for my pulse to start climbing. Static rolled through the speaker like wind across gravel. When the voice returned, it carried coordinates I recognized instantly, even though I hadn't seen them on a map since my first year in the park. They pointed to a sealed zone deep in the forest, an area closed after a cluster of deaths that never made it into the official reports. Not because they were classified, because no one could explain them without sounding unhinged. Repeat last, I said, already knowing the answer. The coordinates came again, identical down to the decimal. My name is not important, but my age is. I was 39 that winter, old enough to have outlived my early bravado, young enough to still believe that experience counted for something. I grew up not far from here, in a logging town that taught its children early that the forest gives and takes on its own schedule. By the time I joined the National Park Service, I already knew how to walk quietly, how to read broken branches like sentences, how to tell when the woods were watching back. Olympic National Park was my jurisdiction, my responsibility. Rainforest, coastline, mountains, all stitched together by fog and silence. I had pulled lost hikers out of ravines, mediated disputes between armed hunters and terrified campers, and stood over bodies that the forest had decided to keep. But nothing in my training manual covered answering a call from a unit that no longer existed. Echo 7, I said slowly. That unit was decommissioned in 2002. If this is a test or interference, we're not cleared to leave, the voice interrupted. The strain was more obvious now, the way someone sounds when they are repeating a sentence they have said too many times. We've been trying Channel 9 for hours. You're the first response. My mouth went dry. 6 years. That unit had been pulled after a winter patrol never returned from a cave system near those coordinates. 3 rangers. Search teams found their gear scattered along a ridge, radios smashed, boots neatly lined up outside a cave mouth that went deeper than our maps accounted for. The official cause was exposure. The unofficial consensus was that something down there had made men who knew the forest very well decide to remove their boots and walk barefoot into the dark. Echo 7, I said, and this time I could not keep the edge out of my voice. State your personnel. Another pause. Longer. 2 rangers, the voice said. 1 injured. I stood, chair scraping against the floor, and moved toward the map pinned to the wall. My reflection in the glass caught my eye. Jaw tight, eyes too bright. Denial is not a switch you flip, it is a process. It starts with small, reasonable objections. This had to be interference. A bleed through from an old recording, some atmospheric anomaly bouncing a signal back at us. The Olympic Mountains were notorious for that. I had explained it to enough frightened visitors to recite it like scripture. And yet, what is your injury status? I asked. He won't stop shaking, the voice said. He says he can hear something moving in the rock. The pen slipped from my fingers and clattered to the floor. Caves had always unsettled me. Not because of the dark, but because of the way sound behaves underground. Noise doesn't travel in straight lines there. It bends, loops, comes back altered. You hear footsteps that aren't yours, breathing that doesn't match your own. Describe the movement, I said. It's not footsteps, the voice replied. It's weight, like something shifting its balance, and sometimes it stops, like it knows we're listening. I keyed the mic off and stood there, staring at the coordinates until they blurred. Protocol said I should escalate, notify command, request verification. Instinct said that if this was real, if there were men alive in that sealed zone, they did not have time for paperwork. I keyed the mic back on. Echo 7, remain where you are. I'm mobilizing a response. Negative, the voice said immediately. Do not send anyone else. That stopped me cold. Say again. Whatever's here, the voice continued, quieter now, it followed us in. It doesn't like light or radios. When we transmit, it moves closer. I felt something old and unwelcome stir in my chest, a memory from my second year in the park. A report of something large moving through the tree line at dusk, leaving tracks too wide, too deep. We'd chalked it up to a bear with a deformity. We always found a way to make the explanation fit. What did you see? I asked. Another pause. Then, very softly, we didn't see it. We heard it breathing. The radio clicked, and for a moment all I could hear was static. Underneath it, though, so faint I almost convinced myself it was my imagination, there was a low, rhythmic sound, like air being pulled through a chest that was far too large to be human. Echo 7, I said, my voice barely above a whisper now. How long have you been down there? The reply came slower this time, each word measured. Longer than we should be. The cave doesn't match the maps. It keeps going. And there are marks on the walls, like something has been counting. My mind reached for reason and came back empty-handed. The cave system in that zone had never been fully charted. We sealed it because we ran out of answers, not because we found them. Listen to me, I said, forcing calm into my tone. You need to move toward the entrance. Follow your rope lines. Stay together. We tried, the voice said. The tunnel we came through isn't there anymore. The station felt suddenly too small, the walls pressing in as the rain outside intensified, drumming like a warning. I thought of the old stories the local tribes told about beings that lived where stone swallowed sound, guardians that were not meant to be seen. I had filed those stories away under cultural context, something to respect but not believe. Echo 7, I said, I need you to keep transmitting. Whatever you do, don't go silent. There was a sound then, not static, not breathing, a deep, resonant knock as if something enormous had struck the rock nearby with deliberate force. The voice came back, no longer trying to hide the fear. It's learned the radio, he said. It knows when we talk to you. The transmission cut abruptly, leaving me alone with the hum of the station and the certainty that whatever waited in that sealed section of forest had just become aware of me. I stood there for a long time after that, hands still on the mic, listening to a channel that should have been dead and understanding, too late, that my confidence had been built on the assumption that the forest followed rules I understood. I did not log the call right away. That alone should tell you how deeply it shook me. Rangers are trained to document everything. Timestamps, weather conditions, verbatim transcripts. Paper is how we keep the wilderness from swallowing events whole. But that night, I stood in the radio room with my finger hovering over the incident log, unable to commit the words to record because writing them down would make them real in a way listening had not yet done. Instead, I listened. Channel 9 stayed quiet for nearly 4 minutes. In that silence, my mind did what it always does when fear threatens to take control. It started building scaffolding out of logic. Old equipment can be reactivated, frequencies can be hijacked, coordinates can be guessed, voices can be mimicked. I told myself this was a hoax, or at worst, a misunderstanding layered on top of coincidence. Then the radio clicked again. "Dispatch," the voice said, thinner now, like it had been scraped raw by shouting. "It's closer." My shoulders hunched instinctively, as if the thing he was describing could hear me through the walls. "Echo 7, identify what you're seeing," I said. "We can't see it," he replied. "But the air's changing. It smells like wet iron and fur." That word landed heavily. Fur. Bears shed. Elk pass through. Mountain goats lose clumps of hair on rock faces. There were explanations. There were always explanations. But none of them accounted for what came next. The injured ranger, his breathing suddenly audible in the background, began to cry. Not sobs. Whimpers. The kind a person makes when their body has decided survival is no longer guaranteed. "It's standing up," the first ranger said. "Whatever it is, it's taller now." A memory surfaced then, uninvited. A report from a winter patrol years earlier, footprints found after a snowfall near a high ridge. They'd been long, almost human, but too wide, the stride too even. I had been the one to write the final note on that report, likely misidentified animal tracks due to melting conditions. I swallowed hard. "Echo 7, I need you to stay calm. Panic will get you killed faster than anything else." "That's easy for you to say," he snapped, then immediately softened. "Sorry. We're just—" He stopped mid-sentence. "What?" I pressed. "It's blocking the tunnel," he whispered. "It's not attacking. It's just waiting." The radio crackled, and for a brief, terrifying second, another sound layered over the static, a deep, resonant exhale, slow and deliberate, as if something massive were breathing directly into the microphone. I pulled the radio away from my face, heart hammering. The sound was wrong, too controlled. Animals breathe fast when threatened. This was measured, patient. "How long since your last movement?" I asked, forcing myself back into the rhythm of command. 30 minutes, the ranger replied. "We turned off our headlamps. It reacted to the light." That detail mattered. Predators react to light, yes, but they also flee from it when it's unfamiliar. This thing did not flee. I made a decision then that I would later pay for in ways I could not have anticipated. I grabbed my jacket, my sidearm, and the spare radio kept on the wall. An older model, analog, less prone to interference. Protocol demanded backup. My gut demanded immediacy. "I'm coming in," I said into the mic. "No," the voice said, sharp with sudden urgency. "You can't." "Echo 7, I'm the only one close enough to reach you before dawn," I replied. "If you're alive, I'm not leaving you there." There was a long silence. When the ranger spoke again, his voice had changed. It carried something like relief and something else, darker. "If you come," he said, "do not follow the sounds. It can make them." The transmission ended there, not abruptly this time, but like someone gently setting the radio down. I locked the station behind me and stepped into the rain. The forest swallowed the beam of my flashlight within a few feet, the droplets in the air turning it into a hazy cone of white. As I drove toward the sealed zone, the road narrowed, pavement giving way to gravel, then mud. Trees leaned inward, their branches knitting together overhead like ribs. I had patrolled this area countless times before it was closed. I knew the way the ground sloped, where the streams cut across the path, where the fog liked to settle thickest. That night, everything felt subtly wrong. Distances stretched. Turns came sooner than expected. My headlights caught shapes between the trees that vanished when I looked directly at them. At the perimeter gate, I stopped. The metal barrier was still chained, the warning signs weathered but intact. I cut the engine and sat there, listening. The forest was too quiet. No insects, no wind through the canopy, silence that felt intentional. I radioed once more. "Echo 7, this is dispatch. I'm at the perimeter." Static answered. Then faintly, "It followed you." My chest tightened. "What do you mean?" "We can hear it moving again," the ranger said, "but it's not near us anymore. It's going the other way." Toward me. I scanned the tree line, flashlight trembling despite my grip. "Describe the movement." "Slow," he said. "Heavy, like it knows it doesn't need to hurry." I thought of the stories told by old rangers over campfires, the ones dismissed as stress-induced hallucinations. Creatures that lived in the high country, tall enough to look down into lookout towers, beings that avoided cameras but learned the patterns of patrols. "You need to listen carefully," I said. "I'm going to leave my vehicle and approach on foot. If you hear anything change, anything at all, you tell me." The gate groaned softly as I unchained it, the sound impossibly loud in the stillness. As I stepped past the boundary, the air seemed to thicken, carrying that same metallic scent the ranger had described. My radio hissed. "It stopped," came the whisper. "It's listening again." Every instinct screamed at me to turn back, to seal the gate and call for daylight, backup, reason. Instead, I moved forward, boots sinking into wet earth, heart pounding so hard I was certain whatever waited ahead could hear it. I had entered that forest believing I was the rescuer. By the time the cave entrance came into view, dark, gaping, marked by faint scratches in the stone that looked disturbingly deliberate, I understood the truth. I was being led. The cave mouth did not look like a place meant to be entered by choice. It sat low against the slope, partially veiled by moss and ferns, as if the forest itself were trying to pretend it wasn't there. Water dripped steadily from the rock lip, each drop striking stone with a hollow, echoing patience. The beam of my flashlight slid over the entrance and came back distorted, the darkness inside swallowing the light faster than it should have. I stopped several yards short and listened. Nothing. No wind, no movement, not even the subtle animal noises that usually returned once you stood still long enough. It felt as though the forest had leaned back, holding its breath, waiting to see what I would do. I keyed the radio softly. "Echo 7, I'm at the cave." The reply came almost immediately, and it startled me how close it sounded, as if the ranger were standing just behind my shoulder instead of buried deep underground. "It knows you're there," he said. "It moved when you stopped." My throat tightened. "Where are you in relation to the entrance?" A pause, then a breath drawn through clenched teeth. "That's the problem. We don't know anymore." I had a sudden, unwelcome awareness of the rock beneath my boots, of how easily stone could shift, could give way. Caves are honest in a brutal sense. They do not care who you are or what your intentions might be. They reduce everyone to the same vulnerability. I took one step forward, then another. The temperature dropped almost immediately, the damp cold seeping through my jacket and into my bones. My flashlight beam caught the first of the markings, then scratches etched into the stone walls near the entrance. Not random. Parallel lines, evenly spaced, running vertically for several feet before disappearing into shadow. They were too high up. "Echo 7, I said, keeping my voice low. "Did you see markings like these on your way in?" "Yes," the ranger replied. "They get deeper the farther you go." That should have been my second warning. The first had been the radio call itself. The third came when the beam of my light brushed across something pale near the wall. Fabric. I moved closer and recognized it immediately, a fragment of a ranger's jacket caught on a jagged edge of stone. The patch was still visible, the emblem faded but unmistakable. This was not from Echo 7's unit. This was older, from the patrol that never came back. My stomach churned. We had told ourselves their gear had been scattered by animals, by weather, by time. Standing there, looking at that torn fabric, the explanation felt thin to the point of dishonesty. The radio hissed softly. "You shouldn't touch anything," the voice warned. "It doesn't like when things change." I froze, my hand hovering inches from the wall. "What do you mean, it doesn't like it?" "It watches patterns," he said. When we moved the rope line, it got angry. A faint sound reached me then from deeper in the cave, a low scrape like stone being dragged slowly across stone. It stopped as soon as I focused on it. My breathing sounded too loud in my ears. I forced myself to slow it, to match the rhythm I had learned during high-altitude rescues. Panic wastes oxygen. Panic makes mistakes. I'm coming in, I said again, though now the words felt less like a promise and more like a surrender. Each step inside felt heavier than the last, the darkness pressing closer, swallowing detail. The walls narrowed, the ceiling lowering until I had to hunch forward. The smell grew stronger. Iron and something animal, wet and sour. "Do you hear that?" the ranger whispered. I listened. At first, there was only the steady drip of water. Then, beneath it, a sound so subtle it almost escaped notice, a faint clicking, irregular like nails tapping against bone. "Yes," I said. "I hear it." "It's counting," he replied. My pulse spiked. "Counting what?" "Steps," he said. "Breaths. We're not sure." The tunnel opened abruptly into a wider chamber, my light revealing a space larger than expected, the ceiling lost in shadow. The walls here were covered in marks, scratches, gouges, and something else. Symbols, maybe. Not letters, not quite shapes I recognized, but arranged in repeating patterns that made my eyes ache if I stared too long. In the center of the chamber lay a helmet, one of ours, cracked down the middle. I crouched beside it, dread pooling in my gut. "Echo 7, I found equipment. Old." "That means you're close," the ranger said. His voice trembled now. "Too close." The clicking sound shifted, moving to my left, then to my right. It did not echo the way it should have. The sound seemed to come from everywhere at once. "Turn off your light," the ranger said urgently. "Now." Every rational part of me rebelled against that instruction. Darkness underground is absolute. It erases orientation, depth, safety, but something in his tone, raw pleading, cut through my resistance. I switched off the flashlight. The darkness slammed into me, thick and total. For a heartbeat, I felt utterly alone. Then I felt it, a pressure change like a body passing close by. The air shifted, heavy and warm, carrying that same iron scent, stronger now. I could hear breathing, not fast, not aggressive, curious. The radio crackled softly. "It's right there," the ranger whispered. "Don't move." I did not move. My muscles locked, every nerve screaming. In the darkness, my mind filled the void with images. Too tall, too broad, fur matted with moisture, eyes set high enough to watch from above. A low rumble vibrated through the stone beneath my boots. Not a growl, but something closer to a vocalization. Communication. The clicking stopped. When it resumed, it was closer, slower, deliberate. I realized then that it was not counting me anymore. It was learning me. A sudden sound cut through the tension, a sharp crack from deeper in the cave, followed by a cry of pain over the radio. "He moved," the ranger gasped. I told him not to move. The breathing near me shifted instantly, the air rushing away as something massive withdrew, the darkness seeming to pull with it. The clicking accelerated, echoing down the tunnel toward the voices. I turned the flashlight back on and ran. I did not think. I did not plan. I followed the sound of my own boots, the narrow beam of light bouncing wildly off the walls. Behind me, stone scraped against stone, fast now, no longer patient. "Echo 7! I shouted into the radio. "Get out! Whatever you do! Get out now!" Static answered. Then screaming, cut short with a wet, choking sound that made my blood run cold. I burst back into the narrow tunnel, lungs burning, heart hammering. The cave seemed to twist, passages branching where I did not remember them branching. The scratches on the walls blurred together, guiding and misleading all at once. Something roared then, not loud, but deep enough to shake dust from the ceiling. It was not the sound of a territorial animal. It was the sound of something offended. I stumbled, caught myself, and saw the faint outline of the cave entrance ahead, a rectangle of gray night cutting through the darkness. I did not stop running until I was past the threshold, until rain soaked my face and the forest air rushed into my lungs. Behind me, at the edge of the light, something stood just inside the cave, tall enough that its head brushed the rock ceiling, eyes reflecting my flashlight in a dull amber glow. It did not pursue. It simply watched, breathing slow and steady as if committing me to memory. When I finally reached my truck, shaking so badly I could barely turn the key, the radio crackled one last time. "Dispatch," the voice said. Not the Rangers this time, but layered, distorted, too deep. "Channel 9 is clear." Then it went silent. I drove away knowing two things with terrible certainty. Whatever lived in that cave had learned how to speak, and it knew my voice. I did not sleep after that night. Not then. Not for a long time afterward. The report I eventually filed was clinical to the point of cruelty. I documented an unauthorized transmission, a failed rescue attempt, evidence of structural instability within a sealed cave system. I used words like interference, disorientation, probable wildlife activity. I did not mention the breathing. I did not mention the counting. I did not mention the way the voice on the radio had worn the shape of authority without the weight of humanity behind it. Echo 7 was never found. Officially, no such unit had been active that night. Unofficially, the cave was resealed within 48 hours, this time with concrete and steel, and the surrounding area was scrubbed from public maps. Channel 9 was removed entirely from our radios, not archived, deleted. I stayed on duty. That surprised some people. There's an assumption that fear drives people away from places like this, that once you've seen too much, you either quit or go numb. The truth is more complicated. Fear can also bind you. It can root you to a place because leaving feels like surrendering the only chance you have to understand what happened. But I was not the same ranger after that night. I became quieter, more deliberate. I stopped dismissing reports too quickly. The ones from hikers who swore they heard their names called from tree lines, from campers who described heavy footsteps circling their tents without ever approaching, from seasonal staff who refused to work certain zones after dusk. I didn't validate their conclusions, but I stopped erasing them with easy explanations. I also stopped going into caves. Olympic National Park has dozens of them, some mapped, some rumored, some known only to the tribes who have lived here far longer than we have held permits and badges. When assignments came up involving subterranean surveys, I traded shifts. When pressed, I cited past trauma. That word smoothed things over. It gave shape to something no one wanted detailed. The dreams started about 6 months later. In them, I was back in the radio room, Channel 9, hissing softly, waiting. Sometimes the voice that came through sounded like the ranger, strained, afraid. Sometimes it sounded like me. Always, it knew my name. I would wake with the sensation of being watched, of something patient and vast, turning its attention toward the surface. I began to notice patterns in the field that I had overlooked before. How certain animal paths curved unnaturally wide around specific rock formations. How birds avoided entire valleys even during migration. How sound behaved strangely near sealed areas, bending and thinning, as if the air itself were reluctant to carry it inward. Once, during a winter patrol near the perimeter of the closed zone, I found tracks in fresh snow that stopped abruptly at the tree line. Not turned back, not scattered, just ended, as though whatever made them had lifted straight up. I stood there for a long time, snow settling silently around me, and understood something that had been forming slowly since the night of the call. The forest does not just contain danger. It contains memory. We like to think of national parks as preserved spaces, snapshots of wilderness held safely behind rules and signage. But preservation is not control. It is an agreement. We promise to respect what is there. In return, we are allowed to pass through, to witness without fully understanding. That night in November, I broke that agreement without realizing it. I assumed the forest would bend to urgency, to procedure, to my sense of duty. I assumed that because I wore the uniform, because I knew the land, I was entitled to answers. What lived in that cave did not share those assumptions. Years later, when I trained new rangers, I emphasized things that never made it into the manuals. I told them to pay attention to their instincts, not because instincts are magical, but because they are often the first language the environment uses when words fail. I told them that silence can be information, that repetition is rarely accidental, that some boundaries exist not to keep people out, but to keep something else in. I never told them about Channel 9. The park has changed since then. New technology, new leadership, new signage explaining closures in polite, non-threatening language. Visitors still come looking for solitude, for awe, for the reassurance that nature is something you can step into and out of unchanged. I watch them sometimes from a distance, families with maps and headlamps, couples laughing too loudly to mask their nerves, solo hikers hungry for something unnamed. I see myself in them, years ago, confident and certain. On quiet nights when the rain falls just right and the fog settles low among the trees, I swear I can still feel it, that subtle pressure shift, like the forest's attention turning. When that happens, I check my radio without thinking, thumb brushing over channels that no longer exist. It has never spoken again. But I know better than to believe that means it cannot. I am older now, closer to retirement than to my first day in uniform. When people ask why I stayed so long, why I didn't move on to something safer, I tell them the truth, but not all of it. I tell them that someone has to remember where the lines are, because the wilderness is not cruel. It is not malicious. It does not hunt us for sport or spite. What it does, what it has always done, is keep its own counsel. It allows us to exist alongside it only so long as we respect the weight of what we do not understand. That cave is still there, buried under layers of stone and policy. The thing inside it may still be counting. Steps, breaths, years. And somewhere, deep beneath the roots and rain of Olympic National Park, Channel 9 is waiting. Quiet, patient, listening for a voice it recognizes. I make sure it will never be mine again. The silence of the Blue Ridge Mountains isn't a lack of sound. It is a weight, a heavy, velvet pressure that settles into the marrow of your bones when the sun drops behind the jagged teeth of the horizon. I have spent 12 years walking the Pisgah National Forest, and I have learned that the woods don't care about your maps, your GPS, or the badge pinned to your chest. My name is John Athan, and at 38 years old, I have seen the way the light filters through the canopy in 1,000 different hues, but nothing prepared me for the color of the shadows in October 2013. This forest is a cathedral of ancient hemlocks and sprawling oaks, a place where the air smells of damp earth and decaying leaves, but it is also a place where the geography of the mind can become as tangled as the underbrush. People come here to find themselves, but more often than not, they find that the person they brought into the woods isn't the one who walks back out, if they walk out at all. Working as a ranger in North Carolina isn't just about trail maintenance or checking permits. It's about being a shepherd for souls who don't realize they are wandering through a graveyard of forgotten history. The local folks, the ones whose families have lived in the hollers for 6 generations, they have a different way of looking at the Pisgah. They don't talk about recreation. They talk about respecting the boundary. They know that there are pockets of these mountains where the clock hands don't just spin, they stop. I used to laugh at those stories over coffee at the general store in Brevard. I believed in the USGS surveys, the radio frequencies, and the predictable behavior of black bears. I believed that if you knew the terrain, you owned it. That was my first mistake. The arrogance of thinking a human life, which spans 80 years if you're lucky, could ever truly comprehend a landscape that has been dreaming for millions. On that October night, the fog was crawling up from the French Broad River like a living thing, thick and tasting of iron. I was patrolling the high ridges near the Shining Rock Wilderness, a routine check after reports of an illegal campfire. The wind was whispering through the rhododendrons, a sound like dry hands rubbing together. It was 11:40 p.m. when the familiar world began to fray at the edges. I knew these trails like the back of my hand, or so I told myself. But the fog has a way of erasing landmarks, turning a well-trodden path into a labyrinth of gray on gray. I checked my compass, but the needle was sluggish, shivering as if it were cold. I felt a prickle of unease at the base of my neck, a physical sensation of being watched, not by a predator, but by the forest itself. That was when I saw it. Rising out of the mist like a skeletal finger pointing at the moonless sky was a fire lookout tower. I stopped dead, my boots sinking into the soft mast of the forest floor. I knew this sector. I had mapped it, hiked it in the blazing heat of July and the bone-chilling frost of January. There was no tower here. The nearest lookout was miles to the west on Frying Pan Mountain. This structure was old, the wood blackened by decades of rain and sun, the steel legs rusted to the color of dried blood. It stood in a clearing that shouldn't have been there, a perfect circle of dead grass where the trees refused to grow. My rational mind, that stubborn part of me that clings to order, screamed that I had simply taken a wrong turn, that the fog had disoriented me. But my gut, that primal instinct we try so hard to bury under civilization, knew better. My gut knew that I had stepped off the map. The tower didn't have a name. It didn't have a number. As I approached, the air grew unnaturally cold, the kind of cold that feels like it's stealing the heat directly from your lungs. The stairs creaked under my weight, a slow, rhythmic groan that echoed into the dark. Each step felt like a betrayal of my training. I should have turned back. I should have keyed the radio and called for a location check. But my fingers were numb, and a strange hypnotic pull was drawing me upward. I needed to see what was in that cabin at the top. I needed to know why a piece of history had manifested in a place where it didn't belong. When I reached the trapdoor and pushed it open, the smell hit me, not of rot, but of old paper and ozone, the scent of a library that had been struck by lightning. The interior of the lookout was immaculate, a sharp contrast to its weathered exterior. A small wood stove sat in the corner, cold but clean. A desk was positioned by the window, overlooking a sea of fog that looked like a frozen white ocean, and there, lying open in the center of the desk, was the logbook. My heart was hammering against my ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. I reached out, my hand trembling, and turned the book toward the dim light of my headlamp. The ink was fresh, the loops of the letters familiar. I felt the world tilt on its axis. The entries were written in my own handwriting. My signature, with the distinct flourish on the E that I'd practiced since I was a teenager, stared back at me. But it wasn't the handwriting that made the air vanish from the room. It was the dates. The last entry was dated November 14th, 2013, 3 weeks into the future. "The wind is changing," the entry read. "He's closer tonight. I can hear the clicking beneath the floorboards. I should have listened to the old men in the holler. The woods don't want us here. I'm tired of running. If anyone finds this, don't look for the cave. Whatever is in there has been waiting for someone like me to fill the silence." I dropped the book as if it had burned me. This was impossible. It was a prank, a cruel, elaborate joke played by the other rangers. But how could they mimic my handwriting so perfectly? How could they build a tower in the middle of a wilderness area overnight? I backed away from the desk, my breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps. The silence of the cabin was suddenly broken by a sound from below, the slow, rhythmic thud of something heavy hitting the wooden stairs. Thump, thump, thump. It wasn't the sound of a person walking. It was the sound of something pulling itself up, a weight that didn't belong to a human frame. I scrambled for my sidearm, but my holster was empty. I looked down, confused, and saw that I wasn't wearing my patrol belt. I wasn't even wearing my ranger uniform. I was dressed in heavy wool, the kind of clothes a man wears when he's preparing for a long, cold winter. My mind fractured. Where was my gear? When had I changed? The panic began to bloom in my chest, a dark flower of terror that choked out all reason. I wasn't John Athan the Ranger anymore. I was a man trapped in a nightmare that wore the face of his own life. The thumping on the stairs stopped. There was a long, agonizing silence, and then a soft scratching at the trapdoor. A voice, thin and reedy, whispered my name through the wood. It sounded like my own voice, but distorted, as if played through a broken radio. "John Athan," the voice said. "Open the door. The moon is almost full, and the shadows are hungry." I threw my weight against the trapdoor, locking the latch with a frantic jerk of my hands. I was shaking so hard I could barely stand. I looked around the room for a weapon, a tool, anything. On the wall hung a map of the Pisgah, but the landmarks were all wrong. The mountains were named things like Sorrow's Peak and the Valley of Lost Tongues. In the center of the map, right where I stood, was a black circle labeled the Watchtower of the Unseen. I realized then that I wasn't just lost in the woods. I was lost in a version of the world that had been warped by something ancient and hungry. The fear wasn't coming from the thing on the stairs anymore. It was coming from the realization that my memories, my identity, and my very reality were as fragile as the fog outside. I sat on the floor, my back against the trapdoor, listening to the scratching. It sounded like claws on dry timber. I closed my eyes and tried to remember the drive to the trailhead, the sound of my truck's engine, the taste of the coffee I'd had at the station. But the memories were slipping away, replaced by images of a deep, dark cave and a figure standing in the shadows with eyes like cold stars. I had to get out. I had to break the cycle. I stood up and looked out the window. The fog had cleared slightly, and in the distance, I saw a light, a single, flickering yellow light. It wasn't a ranger station. It was a campfire. And standing around it were figures that were too tall, their limbs too long, their movements jerky and unnatural. They were looking up at the tower. They were waiting for me to come down. I turned back to the logbook, desperate for a clue, a way out. I flipped the pages back, searching for the beginning of this madness. The entries went back years, all in my handwriting, detailing a life I didn't remember living. Entries about a wife I never had, a child I never held, and a fear that had been gnawing at my soul since before I was born. I saw an entry from October 2013, the very night I was living. He's here. He found the tower. He thinks he's a ranger. He doesn't know yet that he's the keeper. He doesn't know that the forest needs a witness to its hunger. The scratching at the door stopped. The voice spoke again, but this time it wasn't a whisper. It was a command. Look at the handwriting again, John Athan. Look at the ink. I leaned over the book, my headlamp flickering. The ink wasn't black or blue. It was red. A deep, iron-rich red that was still tacky to the touch. I looked at my own fingers. They were stained. I felt a sharp pain in my side and reached under my wool sweater. My hand came away wet. I wasn't just a witness. I was the sacrifice. The tower wasn't a lookout. It was an altar. And the forest wasn't just a setting. It was the priest. I knew then that the only way to survive was to face the thing that was trying to rewrite my story. I had to go down into the dark. I had to find the cave mentioned in the logbook. Because in the Pisgah, the only way to find the light is to walk through the heart of the shadow. The trapdoor shuddered under the weight of a sudden, violent blow from below. But I didn't scream. The terror had passed through the stage of panic and reached a cold, crystalline clarity. I understood now that I was caught in a loop of time that felt like a coiled snake, and the only way to break the circle was to stop acting like the prey. I looked at the red-stained entries in the logbook once more. The dates were impossible. The events were horrific, but the handwriting was undeniably mine. If I had written this in the future, it meant I survived this night. Or, more accurately, a version of me survived to become the thing that sits in this tower and waits for the next cycle to begin. I wouldn't be that man. I wouldn't be the keeper of this nightmare. I grabbed the heavy brass compass from the desk, the only solid object that felt like it belonged to the world I remembered. I didn't use the stairs. I knew the thing was waiting there, huddled in the darkness of the landing, mimicking my breath. Instead, I smashed the glass of the observation window. The sound was like a gunshot in the silent forest. The wind rushed in, smelling of ancient frost and something metallic, like old coins. I climbed onto the narrow catwalk outside, the rusted metal groaning and swaying over the abyss. Below me, the forest floor was swallowed by a mist so thick it looked like solid ground, but I knew the drop was 60 feet of jagged rock and unforgiving timber. I looked toward the campfire I had seen earlier. The tall, spindly figures were gone, but the fire remained, a tiny orange spark in the vast, suffocating blackness. That was my North Star. I began to climb down the exterior of the tower, my fingers gripping the freezing steel, until the skin peeled away. My muscles screamed, and the wound in my side pulsed with a rhythmic, dull heat, but I didn't stop. Halfway down, the tower began to vibrate. I looked up and saw a pale, elongated face peering over the edge of the catwalk. It had no eyes, only deep, hollow sockets filled with the same shifting fog that blanketed the woods. It didn't move to grab me. It just watched, its mouth hanging open in a silent, mocking mimicry of my own exhaustion. When my boots finally hit the earth, the ground felt wrong, too soft, like walking on the skin of a drum. I didn't look back at the tower. I ran. I ran toward the light, crashing through rhododendron thickets that clawed at my face and arms. The forest had changed again. The trees were no longer the sturdy oaks of the Pisgah. They were twisted, gnarled things with bark that looked like stretched skin. The silence was gone, replaced by a low, vibrating hum that seemed to come from deep underground. It was the sound of the earth breathing, a slow, tectonic inhalation that made my teeth ache. As I drew closer to the campfire, the trees thinned out, revealing a clearing dominated by the mouth of a massive limestone cavern. The fire wasn't a campfire at all. It was a fissure in the earth, a crack in the rock where a dull, bioluminescent glow leaked out like a slow bleed. And there, sitting by the edge of the glow, was a man. He was wearing my ranger uniform, the green trousers, the tan shirt, the badge. He was sitting with his back to me, his head bowed as if in prayer or deep sleep. "Hey!" I shouted, my voice cracking. "Who are you?" The man didn't move. I approached slowly, the brass compass held out like a weapon. When I was a few feet away, I reached out and touched his shoulder. He slumped over, and I realized with a jolt of horror that he wasn't a man at all. He was a husk, a perfectly preserved shell of a human being, hollowed out and stuffed with dry leaves and mountain laurel. His face was a mask of my own features, frozen in an expression of absolute, soul-shattering realization. On his lap sat a stack of blank logbook pages and a shard of flint. This was the source of the red ink. I backed away, stumbling toward the mouth of the cave. The humming was louder here, a physical force that vibrated in my chest. I realized that the tower wasn't the center of this anomaly. The cave was. The tower was just the lookout, that the place where the forest kept its witnesses so they could record the slow digestion of reality. I looked at the compass in my hand. The needle wasn't pointing north anymore. It was spinning wildly, a silver blur that eventually snapped toward the dark throat of the cavern. The doubt that had been flickering in my mind finally caught fire. I remembered my name, John Athan. I remembered my age, 38. But when I tried to remember my mother's face or the house I grew up in, there was nothing but gray mist. I tried to remember the name of the ranger who had trained me, the face of the woman I had shared a beer with last Friday. Nothing. It was as if my entire life had been a script written 5 minutes ago, a set of false memories designed to give me enough self to be worth consuming. The fear wasn't just about dying anymore. It was the fear that I had never actually lived. "You're not real," I whispered into the dark. The cave answered with a sound like 1,000 dry leaves skittering across a floor. Click, click, click. Out of the darkness of the cavern, something began to emerge. It didn't walk. It unfolded. It was a mountain of pale, matted fur and elongated limbs, a creature that seemed to be made of the very shadows it inhabited. Its face was a nightmare of evolution, half ape, half human, with eyes that held the cold, predatory intelligence of a star that has watched the world grow old. It didn't growl. It didn't roar. It looked at me with a profound, terrifying pity. "The Watcher is lost," the creature said, its voice echoing not in the air, but directly inside my skull. "The circle is broken, Jonathan. You looked at the book too early." I realized then that the Yeti stories the locals told weren't about a monster. They were about the forest's immune system. This thing was a gargoyle, a guardian of the boundary between what is real and what the woods want to forget. It reached out a long gray hand, its fingers ending in claws that looked like polished obsidian. I didn't run this time. There was nowhere left to go. The forest had closed in behind me. the trees knitting their branches together to form a wall of thorns. "What is this place?" I asked, my voice a ghost of itself. "This is the place where the map ends," the creature replied. "You are the ranger of the unrecorded. You have walked the trails of the dead for centuries, Jonathan. Every few decades, you remember. You find the tower, you see your own hand writing the future, and every time, you try to run. But the Pisgah doesn't let go of its own." The creature gestured toward the cave. Inside, I saw movement, hundreds of flickering lights. I realized they weren't fires. They were the eyes of others. Thousands of men and women in uniforms, in hiking gear, in the skins of animals, all standing in the dark, waiting. They were the ones who had wandered off the trail. They were the ones the mountain had kept. I looked down at the brass compass. The glass was cracked. I saw my reflection in the jagged shards, and for a second my face wasn't my own. It was older, much older, with skin like parchment and eyes that had seen the birth of the mountains. I wasn't a 38-year-old ranger from Brevard. I was a part of the forest's memory, a recursive loop of consciousness trapped in a cage of hemlock and stone. The creature stepped closer, its scent filling my nostrils, the smell of wet earth, old blood, and the ozone of the tower. It placed a hand on my chest, right over my heart. The heat from its palm was the only warmth I had felt in what felt like an eternity. "Do you want to see the end of the book?" it asked. I looked back at the husk in the ranger uniform, the empty shell of the man I thought I was. Then I looked into the abyss of the cave. The fear was still there, a cold weight in my stomach, but beneath it was a growing sense of exhaustion. I was tired of the patrol. I was tired of the maps that led nowhere and the radio calls that only returned static. I was tired of being the only one who knew that the trees were watching. "Yes," I said. The creature pulled me toward the darkness. As I stepped over the threshold of the cave, the tower behind me vanished into the fog. The clearing disappeared. The world of roads and houses and light bulbs became a distant, fading dream. I felt the ink of the logbook beginning to write itself onto my skin, the red letters of my future carving their way into my soul. I wasn't escaping. I was arriving. The darkness of the cave wasn't black. It was a vibrant, suffocating violet that pulsed in time with the thrumming of the earth. As I moved deeper, the floor beneath my feet transitioned from damp limestone to something that felt like petrified bone, smooth, cold, and etched with symbols that made my eyes ache if I tried to focus on them. The creature walked beside me, its massive, shaggy frame casting a shadow that seemed to move independently of its body. It didn't lead me like a prisoner. It guided me like a curator showing a guest through a gallery of his own failures. We passed alcoves where the others stood. I saw them clearly now, hundreds of souls suspended in a state of waking sleep. There was a hiker from the 1970s, her bell-bottoms stained with the red clay of the Davidson River, a surveyor from the 1920s with his brass transit still clutched in a skeletal hand, and others, far older, dressed in furs and woven fibers that hadn't been seen in these mountains for 1,000 years. They weren't dead. Their chests rose and fell with a slow, agonizing rhythm, one breath every few minutes. They were the records the creature had spoken of. They were the living memories of the Pisgah stored here to ensure that nothing that ever happened in these woods was truly forgotten. "Why me?" I asked, my voice echoing back as a chorus of whispers. "Why the tower? Why the logbook?" The creature slowed, its long limbs folding as it crouched to my level. "The forest is a mind, Jonathan. But a mind without a hand cannot write. A mind without an eye cannot witness. Every century, the mountain chooses a scribe, someone with the soul of a protector, someone who loves the trees enough to die among them. You were chosen because you didn't just walk the trails, you felt the pain of every broken branch. You noticed the silence before the storm. You were already part of us. We only gave you a desk." It reached out and touched a wall of the cave. The rock rippled like water, and a scene began to form, a memory that wasn't mine, yet felt familiar. I saw the watchtower being built, not by carpenters, but by the forest itself. I saw branches weaving together to form the stairs and the earth vomiting up the iron for the legs. I saw a man, a version of me from a century ago, climbing those stairs for the first time, his face filled with the same desperate confusion I had felt tonight. I saw him pick up the pen. I saw him weep as he realized the dates in the book were his own future. "You are the John Athan of now," the creature whispered. "But you are also the John Athan of then. There is no time here, only the story, and the story demands a climax." We reached the heart of the cavern, a vast chamber where the ceiling was lost in a swirling vortex of mist. In the center stood a pedestal made of gnarled hemlock roots, and upon it lay the logbook, the same one I had dropped in the tower. But it was larger now, its pages expanding to the size of a man's torso. The red ink was glowing with a faint internal light. "The final entry," the creature said, gesturing to the book, "the one you were afraid to read. The one that explains why the tower exists." I approached the pedestal, my legs feeling like lead. My mind was a storm of resistance. Part of me wanted to turn and run, to claw my way back to the surface, find my truck, and drive until the mountains were nothing but a smudge on the rearview mirror. But I knew the boundary was closed. I knew that even if I reached the road, I would only find more fog, more towers, more versions of myself waiting in the dark. The fear had evolved again. It wasn't the fear of the unknown anymore. It was the terrifying, heavy weight of the known. I reached out and turned the final page. The handwriting was no longer just mine. It was a chaotic, beautiful blend of every language I had ever seen and many I hadn't. The letters were woven together like the roots of the trees outside. I read the words, and as I did, the memories of my life in Brevard, the coffee, the truck, the badge, began to dissolve, replaced by a singular, overwhelming truth. "The ranger does not protect the people from the woods," the entry read. "The ranger protects the woods from the light. For if the world truly saw what lies beneath the canopy, they would burn it all to the ground to escape the reflection of their own shadows. I am the lock. I am the key. I am the silence that keeps the secret." Beneath the text was a drawing. It was a map of the entire United States, but it wasn't a map of states or cities. It was a map of the Great Veins, a network of ancient sentient forests that spanned the continent, all connected underground. The Pisgah was just one node. There were others as in the Cascades, the Ozarks, the Maine Woods, and at every node there was a tower. At every node there was a scribe. I looked at the creature. "I'm not the only one." "There are 12 of you," the creature replied. "The watchers of the wild. You keep the balance. You ensure that the human world stays on its paved roads and the ancient world stays in its shadows. But sometimes the line blurs. Sometimes a watcher forgets who he is and thinks he is merely a man. That is when the fear comes. That is when the tower manifests to remind you." I felt a sudden, sharp pain in my chest, right where the creature had touched me earlier. I looked down and saw that my skin was turning the color of old parchment. My fingernails were thickening, becoming dark and sharp like obsidian. The transformation wasn't a curse, it was a homecoming. The wound in my side wasn't a wound at all. It was the place where the forest was grafting itself to my soul. "If I stay," I said, my voice now carrying the same reedy, multi-layered quality as the creature's, "what happens to the man who drove the truck tonight? What happens to John Athan, the ranger?" "He becomes a story," the creature said. "A legend told by the locals in Brevard. The ranger who walked into the fog and never came back. You will be the ghost that keeps the teenagers away from the dangerous cliffs. You will be the wind that warns the hikers to turn back before the sun sets. You will be the awe and the terror that keeps the respect alive." I looked back toward the entrance of the cave where the faint purple light of the forest was visible. I thought about the people I had helped, the lost children I'd found, the campfires I'd extinguished. I realized that my entire career had been a preparation for this. I hadn't been protecting the public. I had been learning the language of the mountains so I could eventually speak for it. The creature handed me a pen. It wasn't made of plastic or metal. It was a sharpened piece of staghorn, dripping with the red ink of the Earth's own heart. "Write the next page, John Athan," the creature commanded. "Write the warnings for the winter. Tell them about the ice that breathes. Tell them about the trees that walk when no one is looking. Protect the boundary." I took the pen. The moment my fingers touched the horn, the last of my human doubt vanished. I felt the roots of the Pisgah stretching out beneath me, felt the heartbeat of every deer and the slow, grinding thoughts of the granite peaks. I wasn't John Athan anymore. I was the watcher. I was the ranger of the unseen. I leaned over the logbook and began to write. I wrote about the night of October 2013. I wrote about the man who found a tower that shouldn't exist. I wrote about the fear that becomes a legacy. And as I wrote, I felt a strange, soaring sense of peace. The world above, the world of clocks and calendars, was so small, so fragile. Down here in the dark, there was a terrifying, eternal beauty. One day, I whispered as the ink flowed, "Another will come. Another will see the light of my fire and think they are lost. And I will be the one on the stairs. I will be the voice in the wind." The creature nodded, its task complete. It began to fade back into the shadows of the cave, its form merging with the rock until only its eyes remained, two cold, bright stars in the violet dark. I was alone in the heart of the mountain, but for the first time in my life, I wasn't lonely. I had the forest's memories to keep me company. I had the stories of 1,000 years to record. I picked up the logbook, and as I did, the cave began to shift. The limestone walls smoothed out, turning into the dark, weathered wood of a lookout cabin. The smell of ozone returned. The sound of the wind through the hemlocks echoed through the windows. I was back in the tower, but the fog was gone. Below me, the Pisgah stretched out in all its autumn glory, a sea of gold and crimson under 1,000,000,000 stars. I looked at the logbook on the desk. The entry for November 14th was already there, written in my hand. But now I knew what the clicking beneath the floorboards really was. It was the sound of the world growing. It was the sound of the secret being kept. I sat down in the chair and looked out at the dark horizon. Somewhere out there, a hiker was setting up a tent. Somewhere, a family was roasting marshmallows, laughing, oblivious to the ancient, hungry gaze of the woods. I smiled, a slow, wooden movement of my lips. They were safe, for now, because I was here. I was the watcher on the wall, the sentinel of the shadows. The hours that followed were not measured by the ticking of a clock, but by the slow rotation of the constellations above the Pisgah. I sat in that high, lonely cabin, watching the world I used to inhabit from a distance that felt like light years. The transition was complete. The man who had a mortgage, a badge number, and a favorite diner in Brevard was gone, dissolved like salt in the rain. What remained was a vessel for the forest's ancient consciousness. I felt the sap rising in the maples 5 miles to the north. I felt the slow, rhythmic grinding of the tectonic plates beneath the Blue Ridge. I felt the panic of a field mouse in the talons of an owl. It was an overwhelming symphony of existence, a sensory flood that would have driven a mortal mind to madness. But my mind was no longer mortal. It was timber and stone. As the first gray smudge of dawn began to bleed into the eastern sky, the watchtower began to hum. It was a low-frequency vibration that resonated in my teeth, a signal. Far across the undulating ridges, beyond the black mountains and the great craggy mountains, I felt a faint, answering shimmer. Another tower, another watcher. We were the anchors of the veil, the points of contact where the logic of man met the wild, chaotic dreaming of the earth. I picked up the staghorn pen one last time to finish the record of my own transformation. My hand moved with a grace that was no longer mine, carving words into the leather-bound pages that seemed to pulse with their own heartbeat. "Let them believe in the animals they can name," I wrote. "Let them believe in the black bears and the mountain lions. Let them believe that the fear they feel when the sun goes down is just a primitive reflex, a remnant of a time before fire and steel. It is better that they fear the shadow than the thing that casts it." For as long as they are afraid, they are careful. And as long as they are careful, the boundary remains. The forest is not a park. It is a presence. It is a slow green god that breathes through the leaves and thinks through the roots. And it requires a witness. I closed the book. The heavy thud of the cover sounded like the closing of a tomb or a sanctuary. I stood up and walked to the observation windows. The fog had completely dissipated and leaving the valley below crystal clear in the pre-dawn light. I saw the winding ribbon of the Blue Ridge Parkway, a tiny, insignificant scar of asphalt on the flank of the mountain. I saw the distant, flickering lights of a waking town. To them, the sun was rising on another day of work, of routine, of simple human concerns. They would never know that their world only existed because someone or something was sitting in a tower that wasn't there, holding the darkness at bay. The reflection in the window was no longer a man. My eyes were wide and golden, reflecting the forest in a panoramic sweep. My skin had the texture of weathered bark, and my breath came out as a fine, cool mist. I realized then that the fear I had felt, the terror of the tower, the dread of the logbook, the panic in the cave, was simply the friction of a soul being pulled out of its old shape. It was the birth pangs of a guardian. You cannot protect the mystery if you are not part of it. You cannot stand at the edge of the world if you are still tethered to the center. I felt a sudden, sharp pang of love for the people down there, the hikers, the dreamers, the lost souls. It was the love a shepherd feels for a flock that doesn't even know he exists. It was a heavy, lonely, and beautiful burden. I reached out and touched the glass, and for a moment, I could feel the heartbeat of everyone currently within the forest's embrace. I felt their dreams, their exhaustion, and the tiny, flickering sparks of their lives. I would be their silence. I would be the strange light they saw from the corner of their eye. I would be the reason they looked back over their shoulder when the wind died down. The sun finally broke over the horizon, a blinding gold that flooded the cabin. But it didn't burn. It didn't reveal the truth in the way I once thought it would. Instead, it only deepened the shadows in the hollers, creating new mysteries for me to record. The watchtower began to fade, its physical form returning to the ether as the human world's rules of light and shadow took hold once more. I didn't fall. I didn't disappear. I simply became part of the atmosphere, a ghost in the machine of the wilderness. To those who come to the Pisgah, to those who wander off the trail in search of something they cannot name, know that you are never truly alone. When the air turns cold for no reason, when the birds go silent and the trees seem to lean in closer, do not panic. That is only the forest checking your pulse. That is only the watcher ensuring you are where you belong. Respect the boundary. Listen to the stories the old men tell in the general stores. They are not myths. They are survival guides. My name was John Athan, and I was once a ranger of the United States Forest Service. Now I am the memory of the mountain. I am the ink in the book that is never finished. I am the shadow that watches the fire. And as long as these trees stand, as long as the fog rolls through the gaps and the moon rises over the ridges, I will be here. I will be the guardian of the things that shouldn't exist and the protector of the secrets that keep us all whole. The forest is calling. Can you hear it? It isn't a sound, it's a beckoning silence, and it's waiting for you to step off the map. The first thing the snow takes from you is sound, and the second thing is certainty. By the time that winter storm settled over Yosemite in February of 2004, I had already learned to respect both losses. Snow doesn't fall the way people imagine in the mountains. It doesn't drift politely. It presses. It leans its full weight against the trees, the ranger stations, the narrow roads that thread through granite and pine. It dulls edges. It smothers distance. It makes every familiar landmark feel borrowed, temporary, like it could be taken back at any moment. My name doesn't matter much anymore, but back then it did. I was 36 years old, 8 winters into my assignment at Yosemite National Park, And I still believe that experience was something you could stack neatly year after year until it formed a wall between you and fear. I believed the badge, the radio, the protocols, the search grids, and the laminated emergency cards in my coat pocket added up to control. I believed the forest noticed the effort. I worked the night shift that week because I volunteered for it. Most people didn't want midnight duty during a storm like that. Visibility down to nothing, temperatures dropping fast enough to make metal burn your skin. But nights were quiet, and quiet had always felt like something I could manage. I told myself I liked the responsibility. I told myself I liked being the one awake when everyone else slept. The locals in the valley used to joke that Yosemite only shows you what it wants you to see, and only when you're already too tired to argue. I laughed along with them in daylight. At night, alone in a ranger station that creaked under the accumulating snow, those jokes came back sharper, more specific, less funny. 3 days before the storm peaked, we logged a missing hiker, male, late 20s, solo, day permit that should have had him back before sunset. The kind of report that starts small and then grows teeth as hours turn into days. We ran the standard procedures, trail checks, aerial when the weather allowed, volunteers bundled into lines, radios crackling with the static of frustration. No sign, no pack, no tracks, after the first snowfall covered everything like a deliberate erasure. By the third night, command quietly shifted the language from search to recovery. That's what storms do. They force decisions that sound cold until you're the one making them. You stop talking about saving and start talking about locating. You stop picturing a living person and start preparing for a body. It's not cruelty, it's math. I was alone in the small station near the old access road, the one tourists rarely noticed even in summer. The power flickered every few minutes, lights dimming as wind shoved against the building like a living thing testing a door. My radio sat on the desk, volume low, just enough to catch a call if it came through. Outside, the snow fell sideways, the beam from the security light carving a white tunnel that went nowhere. Just after midnight, I heard the phone ring. That shouldn't have happened. The payphone inside the park, an old, battered thing mounted near the visitor area, had been out of service for months. Vandalized, then ignored. Everyone carried cell phones now, or thought they did, until the mountains reminded them otherwise. I had signed the maintenance request myself. I remembered the dead tone, the useless weight of the receiver in my hand. The ring cut through the station with a sound that didn't belong. Too sharp, too deliberate. It wasn't muffled by the storm or the walls. It was clean, almost close, as if the phone were in the room with me. I stared at the radio first, expecting it to crackle to correct the mistake. It didn't. The phone rang again. There's a moment before you move in situations like that, a fraction of a second where your body reacts before your reasons catch up. My shoulders tightened. My pulse shifted. I told myself it was a crossed line, a wiring issue, something mundane made strange by exhaustion and weather. I stood, pulled my coat tighter, and walked toward the sound. The payphone was exactly where it had always been, mounted against the wall near the entrance, its metal surface cold enough to bite through gloves. Snow had blown in through the doors and melted into a thin sheen on the floor. The receiver vibrated faintly in its cradle as it rang again, the cord stiff with age. I lifted it. "Yosemite Ranger Station," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "This line is out of service." For a second, there was nothing but the hiss of wind, faint but unmistakable, like the caller was standing outside without shelter. Then a breath, close, ragged. "I didn't think anyone would answer," a man said. His voice was hoarse, worn down to something fragile. He sounded cold in a way that went past shivering, cold the way you sound when you've been cold too long. I asked his name. He told me the name of the hiker we'd stopped looking for that morning. Training kicked in hard enough to feel like relief. I asked where he was. I asked if he was injured. I asked if he could see any landmarks, hear any roads, anything at all. My pen moved across the notepad without conscious thought, writing down words that didn't make sense together. "I'm still in the park," he said. "I didn't leave. I tried to go back the way I came, but it's different now." "Different how?" I asked. "Quieter," he said, "and louder, like everything is under the snow, but it's listening." I told him to stay where he was. I told him help was on the way, even as another part of my mind ran the numbers and knew no one was moving through that storm fast enough. I asked how he was calling me. There was a pause long enough that I thought the line had gone dead. When he spoke again, his voice dropped, as if he were afraid of being overheard. "I found a place," he said. "There's a phone. It's ringing by itself." My grip tightened on the receiver. I looked at the payphone in my hand, the cracked plastic, the faint frost forming along the edges. For the first time since the storm started, I felt something push back against my assumptions. Not panic. Not yet. Something more dangerous. Doubt. I asked him to describe where he was. He talked about trees that leaned inward, about rock faces that felt closer than they should, about a hollow in the ground that breathed warm air into the cold. He said he'd sheltered there the last 2 nights. He said he wasn't alone anymore. When I asked what he meant, the line filled with that wind again, louder this time, threaded with a low sound I couldn't place. Not an animal call. Not quite. "I think it knows my name now," he said. The lights flickered hard enough to plunge the station into darkness for a full second. When they came back, the dial tone was screaming in my ear. The call was gone. I stood there longer than I should have, listening to the dead line, the storm, my own breathing. Outside, the snow continued its steady erasure, and somewhere in the park, something that should not have been able to make a phone call had known exactly which number to dial. I replaced the receiver with a care that felt ceremonial, like closing a door you're not sure will stay shut. For several seconds afterward, I didn't move. I let my gloved hand rest against the cold metal of the phone, grounding myself in something solid, something unquestionably real. My training told me what to do next: log the call, notify command, initiate contact procedures. But my instincts lagged behind, snagged on the impossibility of what had just happened. Missing persons don't call back. They don't wait 3 days through a snowstorm that shuts down roads and buries trails, and then decide to reach out from a phone that doesn't work. They don't describe places that aren't on any map using language that sounds less like geography and more like confession. I went back to the desk and wrote everything down anyway. Time, words, the exact phrasing I could remember. I noted the mention of a hollow, the warmth, the sound beneath the wind. I told myself that people under extreme stress describe things poorly, that hypothermia bends perception, scrambles memory, makes metaphors feel literal. I told myself all of that because it fit neatly into the frameworks I understood. When I radioed command, my voice stayed even. I reported contact. I relayed the details. There was a pause on the other end, the kind that stretches just long enough to feel intentional. "That hiker was declared unrecoverable this morning," the duty officer said carefully. "Weather window closed." "I'm aware," I said, "but he's alive, or was. He knew details from his report that weren't public." Another pause. Static hissed across the line. "Phones are down across the park," he said. "Landlines too. Are you sure?" "I'm sure," I cut in, sharper than I meant to. I took a breath. "I know what I heard. They told me to stay put, to log it, to wait for morning." The storm wasn't breaking until at least noon, maybe later. No search teams were going out in the dark, not for a voice on a dead line. I agreed, because agreement was easier than arguing against weather and policy. After the call ended, the station felt smaller, the walls pressed in with the weight of snow and unanswered questions. I kept expecting the phone to ring again. Every creak of the building set my muscles on edge. An hour passed, then another. The storm howled without variation, a constant white noise that flattened time. I busied myself with routine checks, generator status, door seals, inventory, but my attention kept drifting back to the hollow the hiker described. Warm air in winter meant caves, geothermal vents, places the snow couldn't claim completely, places people got lost. Sometime close to 2 in the morning, the phone rang again. This time, I didn't jump. I closed my eyes first, steadying my breath, and let it ring once more before I answered. I wanted to be certain I wasn't imagining it. The sound cut through me just as cleanly as before. "I told you to stay where you were," I said when I lifted the receiver, a thread of authority in my voice I didn't entirely feel. "I didn't move," the man said. His voice sounded farther away now, like it had to travel. "It moved." I asked him what he meant. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he described the walls of the place he was in. Stone slick with moisture, streaked with mineral deposits that caught the light when he moved his phone closer. He said the ceiling was low enough that he had to crouch. He said the warmth came in pulses. "It breathes," he said quietly. I thought it was the wind at first. A sound came through the line then, unmistakable even through distortion. A deep, resonant exhale, followed by something like the slow drag of weight across rock. My scalp prickled. I held the receiver away from my ear for a fraction of a second before forcing myself to bring it back. "You're not alone," I said. It wasn't a question. "No," he agreed. "But I don't think it's trying to hurt me. Not yet." I told him to stay on the line. I told him to keep talking. I asked him to describe what else he could see, hear, smell. He talked about fur caught on stone, long and coarse, about an odor like wet earth and iron, about footprints in the dust that weren't his. When he said that, something shifted in me. Yosemite has bears, mountain lions, wolves don't range that far south, and nothing else leaves prints that large. I asked him to describe them anyway, clinging to the hope of misinterpretation. "They're wrong," he said. "Too wide, too deep, like it's heavy in a way that doesn't make sense." The breathing sound grew louder, closer. His voice dropped to a whisper. "It's standing up now," he said. "I think it heard you." The line went dead with a sound like tearing fabric. I don't remember deciding to leave the station. I remember putting on my heavier coat, grabbing my headlamp, my radio, my sidearm. I remember the door resisting when I pushed it open, snow piled high against it like a barricade. I remember the shock of cold that stole my breath and replaced it with resolve. If the call was a hoax, I would confirm it. If it was a hallucination born of exhaustion, I would ground myself in the reality of the storm. And if it was something else, something my training hadn't prepared me for, I couldn't sit behind a desk and pretend the woods weren't calling back. The snow swallowed my boots as soon as I stepped off the cleared path. Visibility was down to the length of my outstretched arm. The beam of my headlamp carved a narrow tunnel through the white, illuminating flakes that moved too fast to track individually. Every sound felt amplified inside my hood. My breath, the crunch of snow, the faint creak of trees under load. I followed instinct more than maps, toward the low ground, toward the rock formations I knew well enough to avoid in weather like this. The radio crackled uselessly, reception eaten by terrain and storm. I moved slowly, deliberately, aware that one wrong step could put me in a ravine no one would search until spring. As I descended, the air changed, not warmer at first, but different, thicker, laden with a scent that didn't belong to snow or pine, wet stone, old decay. My light caught the dark mouth of a cave half hidden by drifted snow, the entrance rimed with ice that glistened faintly. I stopped at the threshold, heart pounding hard enough to feel in my throat. The silence there was profound, a pocket carved out of the storm's constant roar. From within, I felt more than heard a low vibration, a presence that pressed against my senses. "Ranger," I called, my voice sounding small. "If you can hear me, respond." For a moment, nothing happened. Then, from deep inside the cave, a sound answered. Not a voice, not an animal call. A deliberate knock, stone on stone, slow and patient, as if something inside had all the time in the world to wait for me to come closer. I stood there longer than was sensible. My body locked between training and instinct, the storm at my back urging retreat, while the cave pulled at me with a gravity that had nothing to do with physics. The knock came again, 2 measured impacts this time, spaced evenly, like a signal repeated for clarity. Whatever was inside wasn't confused. It wasn't startled by my voice or my light. It was acknowledging me. I took one step forward and felt the temperature change immediately. The cold loosened its grip just enough to register like crossing an invisible boundary. My breath stopped fogging so heavily. Water dripped somewhere inside, slow and rhythmic. I told myself, caves trap heat. I told myself geology could explain this. I told myself a lot of things because standing still felt worse than moving. Hello? I said again, louder this time, my voice echoing off stone. I'm here to help. The word help sounded thin in that space. The beam of my headlamp cut into the darkness, revealing walls close enough to touch, streaked with mineral veins that reflected light in dull, bone-colored lines. The floor sloped downward, packed earth and stone worn smooth in places that suggested frequent passage. Not animal tracks. Paths. As if something heavy had moved this way often enough to change the ground. I advanced slowly, every sense stretched tight. The smell was stronger now, unmistakable. Wet fur, iron. The kind of scent you associate with old wounds and places where blood is soaked in and never fully left. My hand hovered near my radio out of habit, though I knew it wouldn't help me here. Ranger, a voice said from deeper in the cave. I froze. It was the same voice, weaker, strained, but unmistakably human. I'm here, I answered, relief and dread colliding in my chest. Where are you? There was a pause, then a soft, uneven laugh that scraped against my nerves. I don't think I can get back the way I came, he said. It doesn't want me to. My mouth went dry. Who doesn't want you to? The answer came, but not in words. Something shifted in the darkness beyond my light, displacing air with a sound like fabric dragged across rock. My lamp flickered. Not out, just a brief dimming that made my pulse spike. When it steadied, I saw movement at the edge of illumination. A shape withdrew just enough to remain mostly hidden. Tall, broad, upright in a way animals aren't for long. Coarse hair caught the light in dull patches, matted and dark. The cave seemed to curve around it, stone framing mass like it belonged there. Every story I had ever dismissed as campfire exaggeration crowded into my mind at once. Yeti, Bigfoot, names people use to make the unknown feel cataloged. None of them fit what I was seeing, because those stories always put distance between the teller and the thing. They never account for what it feels like to be acknowledged by something that shouldn't exist. The man's voice came again, closer now, but I couldn't see him. It found me when the storm started, he said. I thought it was a bear at first. Then it stood up. Are you injured? I asked, forcing my attention back to the task, to the human variable I could still influence. My ankle, he said, and I'm tired. It won't let me sleep. A low sound rolled through the cave then, not quite a growl, more like a resonance deep enough to vibrate in my chest. The shape shifted again, and this time I saw the outline of a shoulder, the suggestion of a head angled toward me. I raised my free hand, palm out, a universal gesture I'd used with aggressive wildlife more times than I could count. Easy, I said, to it or to myself. We're leaving. The thing didn't advance. It didn't retreat either. It simply watched, and the weight of that attention pressed down on me harder than the storm ever could. I realized then that it wasn't blocking the exit. It didn't need to. The cave narrowed behind me, the darkness deeper than the snow outside, and my certainty eroded. Why did you call me? I asked the man, my voice shaking despite my efforts. There was another pause. When he answered, his tone was different, clearer, almost calm. It told me to, he said. It likes your voice. The words landed with a finality that stripped away my last rational defenses. This wasn't an animal guarding territory. This wasn't a lost hiker clinging to delusion. This was something that understood tools, understood communication, understood me well enough to reach through a dead phone line and pull me here. The thing in the shadows shifted its weight. Stone cracked softly under what must have been immense mass. For the first time, I saw its face fully, not details, not eyes or teeth, but the impression of a face where one should be, heavy brow, deep-set darkness that suggested gaze without revealing it. I took a step back. My boot slid on damp stone, and the sound echoed louder than it should have. Instantly, the cave responded. The low resonance swelled, filling the space, vibrating through my bones. The man cried out, a sharp sound of fear and pain. "Stop," I said, the word tearing out of me. "He's hurt." The vibration subsided, though the presence remained. I understood then, with a clarity that terrified me, that this was not a creature driven by hunger or instinct. It was curious, possessive. It had kept the hiker alive through the storm, not out of mercy, but interest. "I'm taking him," I said, my voice steadier now that panic had burned itself out. "He doesn't belong here." The thing leaned forward slightly, enough for the light to catch more of its form. Muscles layered under fur, dense and powerful. An arm shifted and I saw a hand, 5 fingers, thick and calloused, nails dark and blunt. The cave floor trembled as it took one deliberate step toward me. Every survival instinct screamed at once. I didn't fire my weapon. I didn't shout. I did the only thing that felt honest in that moment. "I belong here," I said quietly. "This is my responsibility." The presence stopped. The air felt charged, like the moment before lightning strikes. The man sobbed somewhere behind it, a broken, human sound that cut through the tension. Slowly, impossibly, the thing stepped aside. The path beyond it opened just enough to reveal the hiker slumped against the wall, his leg twisted at an unnatural angle, his face hollowed by cold and fear. His eyes met mine, wide and shining with something like gratitude and something like apology. I moved toward him, never taking my eyes off the shadow beside us. When I reached the man, I wrapped an arm under his shoulders and lifted, feeling how light he was, how close to gone. The thing watched, unmoving, as we passed. At the cave entrance, the storm roared back into existence, sound and cold crashing over me like a wave. I didn't look back until we were outside, until the snow erased the darkness behind us. The cave was already gone, its mouth swallowed by drifting white as if it had never been there at all. The wind hit us like a living force the moment we crossed that invisible line back into the storm. It stole heat, breath, and any illusion that what I just experienced belonged to a world that followed rules. The hiker sagged against me, his weight dead and awkward, every step a negotiation between balance and collapse. I anchored my arm tighter around him and leaned forward, letting muscle memory take over where thought no longer served me. Behind us, there was nothing. No cave mouth. No dark hollow breathing warmth into the night. Just a snow-packed slope and rock faces blurred into anonymity. Yosemite is good at that, at closing doors without leaving hinges behind. We moved slowly, painfully. Each step felt louder than it should have, as if the forest itself were counting them. I didn't know whether I feared pursuit or invitation more. I kept expecting to feel that presence again, like that weight of attention settling between my shoulder blades. But the storm gave me no answers, only resistance. The hiker mumbled as we went, words breaking apart before they could become sentences, names, apologies. Once, clearly, he said my name. I hadn't told him what it was. And when the lights of the station finally cut through the white, I felt something inside me loosen in a way that hurt. I got him inside, got the door shut, got the heater roaring loud enough to feel like a small defiance. I radioed command again, my voice hoarse now, stripped of authority, and left with truth. They heard it. They always do, eventually. By the time the medics arrived at first light, the storm had begun to ease, as if satisfied. The hiker was alive, frostbitten, dehydrated, his ankle shattered badly enough that he'd never hike the same way again. But alive. That word carried weight in a place where it so often didn't apply. They asked him questions while I stood off to the side, arms wrapped around myself, watching steam rise from my own gear as it dried. He answered what he could. He talked about getting lost, about falling, about sheltering from the storm. When they asked him how he survived 3 nights in conditions that should have killed him, he went quiet. He looked at me then, really looked, and shook his head. "I don't think you want that answer," he said. They didn't push. People think rangers are immune to superstition because we wear uniforms and carry radios. The truth is, we learn early when not to ask follow-up questions. Some answers don't add safety, they just add weight. The official report listed exposure, injury, and disorientation. The phone call was written off as a miscommunication, a crossed line, a stress artifact. The cave didn't exist on any map, so it didn't exist at all. Case closed. Recovery upgraded to rescue. A quiet success in a harsh season. I stayed on nights after that, though not by choice anymore. Sleep came hard, shallow, broken by dreams of stone and breath and the sound of something large shifting just beyond light. I found myself listening to the forest differently, not for danger, for recognition. Weeks later, when the snow finally receded enough to bare rock and root, I went back to the area where I thought the cave had been. I told myself it was for closure, for confirmation. The terrain offered nothing, no hollow, no warmth, no tracks, just granite and trees and the slow drip of meltwater that sounded too much like a heartbeat if you listened long enough. What I did find, half buried under debris near a stand of pines, was an old phone receiver. Cracked plastic, a stiff cord torn clean through. It didn't connect to anything. It never had. I left it where it was. People ask me now, years later, why I still work these forests, why I didn't transfer, why I didn't take that experience as a warning and move somewhere with clearer boundaries between what's known and what isn't. The truth is simpler and harder to explain. That night stripped away something I'd relied on without realizing it, the belief that reason is a shield. It isn't. It's a tool, and like any tool, it only works where it belongs. The woods don't care about our categories. They don't owe us explanations that fit comfortably into daylight conversations. Sometimes they give back what they take. Sometimes they just remind you how easily you can be taken. I still answer the phone when it rings at night. Even now, when most stations have upgraded and the old payphones are gone. I listen carefully. I log everything. I follow protocol. And when the snow falls heavy enough to erase the edges of the world, I remember standing at the mouth of a cave that wanted to keep what it found. Missing persons don't usually call back, but sometimes the forest does.